Imagine walking into a courtroom, not as a criminal, but as an ordinary citizen fighting a simple traffic ticket. Now picture the judge looking at you, not your evidence, not your case, but only the color of your skin, and declaring you guilty without even listening. That's exactly what happened to one man. But what the judge didn't know was that this ordinary citizen was no ordinary man at all. He was a federal prosecutor, and what happened next shocked the entire courtroom. Imagine walking into a courtroom where the very person who is supposed to uphold justice has already made up his mind about you without even hearing a word of your defense. The weight of the law, the cold wooden benches, and the intimidating echo of the gavel should represent fairness and truth. But for Jordan, a young black man, that courtroom felt less like a place of justice and more like a trap. Jordan wasn't a criminal. He wasn't standing trial for anything serious. He was just an ordinary citizen, fighting what he believed to be an unfair traffic ticket. On the surface, it seemed simple, something thousands of people deal with every day. But what made this day different was the man sitting high. Above him in the judge's chair, Judge Harold Mason. Judge Mason wasn't new to the courtroom. In fact, he had been wearing the robe for more than 2 decades. To outsiders, he looked like a man of authority, with neatly combed silver hair, a stern face, and the kind of posture that demanded respect. But to the locals, his reputation carried a darker shadow. People whispered that his rulings weren't always about the law. They were about personal bias. And for minorities, those biases almost always worked against them. As Jordan walked in, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit and holding a folder of carefully prepared documents, he carried himself with quiet confidence. He believed that if he presented the truth, justice would prevail. What he didn't realize was that Judge Mason had already labeled him. The moment he stepped through the door, to the judge, Jordan wasn't a responsible young man standing up for himself. He was just another black man trying to talk his way out of trouble. That was the cruel assumption that sat heavy in the room. Even before Jordan opened his mouth, the air was thick with tension. The few spectators in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably, sensing the unfairness before it even unfolded. Jordan was prepared to argue his case with evidence, dashcam, footage that would prove he wasn't at fault. But in Judge Mason's mind, the decision had already been made. He didn't see a man fighting for fairness. He only saw a stereotype. And that single judgment, based on nothing more than skin color, was about to set the stage for one of the most shocking courtroom moments anyone there had ever witnessed. The judge in question, Harold Mason, wasn't just any ordinary man in a black robe. He had been on the bench for over 20 long years. And in that time, he built a reputation that was both respected and feared. With his sharp tongue and icy stare, Mason ruled his courtroom with an iron fist. He rarely smiled, and when he spoke, his words cut like a blade. Some admired his strictness, saying he kept order better than anyone else. But others, especially those who had stood before him, knew a much darker truth. Judge Mason carried himself as though he was untouchable. The way he leaned back in his chair, the way his gavel struck down with finality, the way he silenced anyone who dared to question him, all of it painted the picture of a man who believed he was the ultimate authority in that room. And in many ways he was. With one decision, he could fine, punish, or even destroy the future of those who stood before him. But beneath the polished exterior of a seasoned judge was a dangerous flaw, his prejudice. Locals whispered about it quietly, never too loudly, because no one wanted to cross a man with that much power. Yet the story spread from family to family, neighbor to neighbor. Everyone knew the pattern. Black and brown defendants always seemed to get harsher punishments, heavier fines and fewer chances for leniency than others. It wasn't written down anywhere. There was no official report or statistic that proved it. But the people of that small town didn't need paperwork to see the truth. They saw it in their neighbors' lives. They saw it in the tears of families leaving the courthouse after another harsh ruling. They saw it in the way Mason's tone changed depending on who stood before him. If a wealthy white businessman appeared in court, Mason spoke with patience and civility, often giving the benefit of the doubt. But if a young black man came forward, even for something as minor as a parking violation, Mason's voice grew sharper, colder, dripping with suspicion before the case had even begun. It was an open secret in town. Judge Mason wore the robe of justice, but he didn't wear its principles. And on the day Jordan walked into his courtroom, That hidden bias was about to be exposed in front of everyone. Jordan entered the courtroom, that morning looking every bit the professional he was. His navy blue suit was crisp and tailored, the kind of suit that spoke of discipline and preparation. In his hand, he carried a small leather folder. Inside it were neatly organized documents, evidence and notes he had prepared for this very moment. His shoes shined under the fluorescent lights, and his posture radiated confidence. He wasn't there to cause trouble. He was there to seek fairness. From the outside, Jordan looked calm. But beneath that calm exterior, his mind was focused and alert. He had replayed the moment of that traffic stop over and over in his head, and he knew he had been wrongfully ticketed. His dash cam footage would prove it. All he needed was a fair chance to present it. But sitting high above him on the bench, Judge Harold Mason didn't see a man who came prepared. He didn't notice the professionalism in Jordan's attire, or the dignity in his manner. Instead, his narrowed eyes focused only on Jordan's skin color. In that single glance, Mason had already written the story in his mind. Another young black man trying to escape responsibility. It didn't matter that Jordan had worked tirelessly to build his career. It didn't matter that he spoke politely and carried himself with respect. In the judge's eyes, all of that was invisible. The prejudice Mason carried had already built a wall between justice and truth. The courtroom itself seemed to sense the tension. A few people sitting on the wooden benches turned their heads, curious about the man standing at the defendant's table. Some whispered quietly, wondering if this would be another routine case or another example of Mason's infamous bias. Jordan stood tall, shoulders squared, refusing to let the weight of those assumptions drag him down. He knew what he carried in that folder could change the course of the hearing. He was ready to fight with facts, not excuses. But the moment Mason looked at him, dismissive and cold, Jordan realized something. This was not going to be a fair hearing. Judge Mason wasn't interested in evidence. He wasn't interested in truth. He was already convinced of Jordan's guilt before a single word had been spoken. And that dangerous assumption was about to set the stage for a confrontation neither man would ever forget. Jordan took a deep breath, placed his folder on the desk, and began to speak with calm confidence. His voice was steady, respectful, and clear. "Your Honor, I believe this traffic citation was issued unfairly," he began. He explained how, on the day of the incident, he had been driving cautiously and had every intention of obeying the rules of the road. But suddenly, another vehicle cut directly in front of him, forcing him to react quickly. The police officer who pulled him over, however, had only seen a split second of the situation. Instead of looking at the whole picture, the officer assumed Jordan had failed to yield and immediately wrote him a citation. "I was not at fault," Jordan continued, his tone never wavering. "And I have evidence that proves it." From his folder, he carefully pulled out a USB drive and a set of still images, printed from his dashcam footage. The pictures clearly showed the other car swerving recklessly into his lane. Jordan held them up with quiet determination. "This footage will demonstrate the truth," he said. The courtroom grew silent. Even a few spectators leaned forward, curious to see what the evidence might reveal. For most people, this would have been the turning point, a moment when truth had the chance to shine through. Jordan had done everything right. He stayed calm, he respected the process, and he came prepared with undeniable proof. But Judge Mason didn't see it that way. As Jordan spoke, Mason's face tightened with irritation. The judge's fingers tapped against the wooden bench as though every word Jordan spoke was an inconvenience. To Mason, it wasn't about the evidence or the truth. It was about the fact that a young black man dared to stand in his courtroom and challenge authority. Before Jordan could even finish his explanation, Mason slammed his gavel down with a loud crack that echoed through the room. "That's enough!" he barked, his voice dripping with impatience. "Save your excuses. I don't need a story. I've heard it all before." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jordan froze mid-sentence, shocked that his carefully prepared defense had been cut short so abruptly. The truth was sitting right there, ready to be shown, yet Mason had no interest in seeing it. In that single moment, it became painfully clear the judge wasn't listening. His mind had already been made up. "Save your excuses," Judge Mason barked, his voice echoing through the courtroom like a thunderclap. His hand slammed the gavel onto the desk. with a sharp crack that made even the bailiff flinch. The sound was final, commanding, and dismissive all at once. Mason didn't just interrupt. Jordan, he crushed the very idea that Jordan's words had any value. "I don't need to hear stories," Mason continued, his tone filled with contempt. "People like you are always trying to talk your way out of trouble." The phrase "people like you" lingered in the air like a foul stench. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with quiet curiosity moments before, fell into complete silence. Everyone understood exactly what Mason meant. He wasn't talking about drivers or about defendants in general. He was talking about Jordan's race. He was talking about the color of his skin. Jordan felt his jaw tighten. His fingers curled slightly around the edge of the table. But he didn't allow his emotions to show. Years of discipline and self-control kept him steady. He knew that if he reacted with anger, Mason would twist it into confirmation of his prejudice. So Jordan chose calm over fury. His silence was not weakness, it was strength. But inside he burned. He knew he had evidence that could clear his name. Yet the man in charge of justice refused to even acknowledge it. The gavel wasn't being used to enforce fairness, it was being used to silence him. The spectators in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances, their expressions tight with unease. A few shook their heads, clearly recognizing Mason's bias, but no one dared speak up. After all, this was Judge Mason's courtroom, and in that room his word was law. Still, Jordan's composure unsettled the judge. Mason expected him to argue, to plead, to lose control, but Jordan didn't flinch. He stood tall, his calm presence silently challenging Mason's authority without saying a word. That quiet resilience spoke louder than any outburst could. And though Mason believed he had shut Jordan down, what he didn't realize was that his own words, his own prejudice, were about to become the very evidence that exposed him to the world. Without even glancing at the dashcam footage or the stack of documents Jordan had brought with him, Judge Mason leaned forward, his expression hard and unyielding. His voice rang out across the courtroom with chilling authority. "You're guilty. Pay a $500 fine immediately or face further penalties." The words landed like a hammer. For a moment, the room was completely still. Then came the gasps. Soft at first, then louder as people whispered in disbelief. A fine of that size, delivered so quickly, without even considering the evidence, was not just unfair, it was a blatant abuse of power. Jordan's frustration welled inside him. He had walked into this courtroom believing that truth would matter, that evidence would matter. Yet here was a judge sworn to uphold justice, dismissing it all with a single sentence. It was clear Mason never intended to give him a fair chance. But Jordan didn't flinch. His face remained calm, his posture straight. He had dealt with prejudice before, and he knew the worst thing he could do was lose his composure. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his leather folder. His movements were precise, measured, like a man in complete control of himself. Even while being treated unjustly, he pulled out a document, folded neatly and sealed with an official stamp. Placing it on the table in front of him, Jordan slid it forward with care. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. Instead, he let his quiet confidence speak for him. The spectators leaned in, curious about what he was doing. The bailiff took a step closer, his eyes flicking toward the paper. Even Judge Mason, though trying to maintain his dismissive demeanor, glanced at it with mild irritation. Jordan finally spoke, his tone even and respectful. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "before you enforce that fine, I believe there's something you should see." His words carried a weight that cut through the tension in the room. For the first time, Mason hesitated ever so slightly. He had expected defiance, shouting, or begging, but not this. Not the quiet strength of a man who seemed to hold a card no one else knew about. And in that single moment, the balance of power in the courtroom began to shift. "Your Honor," Jordan began, his voice steady and respectful, though every word carried an undercurrent of quiet strength. "I respect this court, but I also respect the law. And before you accuse me of making excuses, I think you should know who I am." The statement hung in the air, bold and deliberate. The courtroom, still tense from Mason's hasty judgment, seemed to hold its breath. For the first time, Jordan wasn't simply defending himself, he was pushing back, calmly but firmly, against the authority that had tried to silence him. Judge Mason shifted in his seat, irritation flashing in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged. especially not by someone he thought he had already dismissed. His eyebrow arched sharply, his lips curling into a sneer. "And who might you be?" he asked, the question laced with sarcasm. The tone was mocking, almost daring Jordan to embarrass himself further. Mason expected some weak explanation, some attempt at self-importance that he could easily tear down. That was how he kept control, by making others feel small. But Jordan didn't shrink under the judge's gaze. Instead, he straightened his shoulders, his calmness radiating through the room. His hand rested lightly on the folder before him, and with a measured breath, he prepared to reveal the truth. The spectators shifted in their seats, whispering among themselves. A few leaned forward, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Even the bailiff's posture tightened, as though bracing for an unexpected turn. For Mason, this was just another routine case, until now. Something about Jordan's confidence unsettled him. The judge's sneer faltered just slightly, though he tried to hide it behind his authority. Jordan locked eyes with Mason, his voice unwavering. "I'll be glad to tell you exactly who I am," he said, his words slow, deliberate, and commanding attention. The way he spoke made it clear he wasn't just another defendant. The room seemed to grow smaller, the silence heavier. Everyone was waiting for his next words. And even Judge Mason, for all his arrogance, leaned forward in anticipation. What Mason didn't realize was that the answer to his mocking question was about to shake the very foundation of his courtroom and his career. Jordan didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his hand down in anger. Instead, he moved with the same calm precision he had shown from the moment he walked into the courtroom. With steady hands, he reached into his folder, pulled out a leather case, and slid it across the polished table. The case flipped open. And there it was, the gleaming badge of the United States Federal Prosecutor's Office. The golden seal caught the harsh fluorescent lights overhead, flashing for everyone in the room to see. For a second, the badge seemed to glow, as if it were a silent declaration of truth and authority. Jordan lifted his eyes and spoke with quiet authority. "I am Assistant Federal Prosecutor Jordan Wright," he announced. His voice was calm, yet it carried a weight that filled the entire room. "And I am here today not as a prosecutor, but as a citizen defending myself against an unfair charge." The words struck like a thunderclap. The room froze. The whispering stopped. Even the faint shuffling of papers halted as everyone turned their eyes to Jordan. The bailiff, who had been standing stiffly at the side of the room, blinked in shock. His jaw dropped ever so slightly as he glanced from the badge to Jordan, then back to the judge. He had probably escorted countless defendants through this courtroom, but never a federal prosecutor. The spectators leaned forward, their eyes wide. What had started as a routine hearing had suddenly transformed into something extraordinary. They were witnessing a man who wasn't just another defendant. He was someone with the power to challenge even the highest authorities. And Judge Mason, the smug expression that had lived on his face since the start of the hearing, melted instantly. His lips parted, but no words came. For the first time in years, the mask of arrogance cracked. His eyes darted from the badge to Jordan, panic flickering in his gaze. He had thought he was humiliating just another young black man in his courtroom. But in reality, he had been exposing his own prejudice before a federal officer of the law. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary silence. It was the silence of a room that knew everything had just changed. For the first time in his long career, Judge Harold Mason lost control of his composure. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, faltered as the reality of his mistake hit him like a tidal wave. Well, Prosecutor Wright, I didn't realize." The words stumbled out, awkward and broken. The man who had silenced so many others, with confidence, now found himself struggling to form a single sentence. The courtroom watched in stunned disbelief. Some of the spectators, who had seen Mason bark orders and deliver harsh punishments for years, couldn't believe what they were witnessing. The once untouchable judge, reduced to stuttering, looked small for the very first time. Jordan, however, didn't flinch. He held the judge's gaze with calm, unshaken authority. His voice carried the steady rhythm of truth, unshaken by the weight of Mason's title. "That's the problem, Your Honor," Jordan said firmly, each word deliberate. "You didn't care who I was. You didn't care about the evidence. You cared only about your bias." The words cut deeper than any gavel strike. They weren't shouted. They weren't exaggerated. They were simple, undeniable facts, and that made them impossible to ignore. Mason's face reddened, though whether it was from embarrassment or anger, no one could tell. His hands twitched slightly on the bench, as though searching for some shred of authority to cling to. But in that moment, the robe no longer shielded him. His prejudice had been laid bare, and everyone in the room had seen it. The spectators exchanged looks of quiet vindication. Many of them had suspected Mason's unfairness for years, but now it wasn't just whispered rumor. It was exposed in the open, by a federal prosecutor no less. Jordan's calm tone carried more power than any outburst could have. He didn't need to yell, he didn't need to threaten. His presence, his badge, and his words spoke volumes. He had flipped the courtroom dynamic entirely, and Mason knew it. The gavel that once gave him control now felt like dead weight in his hand. For the first time in decades, the judge was the one on trial, judged not by law, but by truth itself. Jordan did not let the silence linger for long. He turned calmly toward the court clerk, his voice unwavering. "Madam Clerk," he said, every syllable deliberate, "I request that the record officially show that this court refused to review valid evidence before issuing a guilty verdict and fine." The room stirred again. It wasn't just a personal accusation anymore. This was being entered into the official record, a permanent mark against Judge Mason's conduct. Mason's eyes widened, and for a brief second, his gavel hovered uncertainly in the air. He had built his career on silencing voices and controlling narratives, but now the narrative was slipping out of his hands. Jordan turned back to face him, his voice calm yet heavy with conviction. "This is not just about a traffic ticket," he continued. The words carried a resonance that went beyond the walls of the courtroom. "This is about whether justice is applied fairly, no matter who stands before you. If the law changes depending on skin color, wealth, or status, then it ceases to be justice at all." The spectators leaned in, hanging on every word. Many had walked into that room expecting another routine case. But now they were witnessing something far bigger, a confrontation that exposed the imbalance of power in their own town. Some nodded silently, their eyes glistening with the recognition that someone was finally saying what they had felt for years. Mason's face flushed a deeper red. His hand twitched toward the gavel again, but even he seemed to realize how useless it had become. Striking it now would only underline Jordan's point that he silenced truth when it threatened his authority. Jordan's calmness was unshakable. His badge lay on the table as proof of his role, but in that moment, it wasn't his title that gave his words power, it was the truth itself. "The law belongs to everyone," Jordan finished firmly, "and the moment it is used as a weapon of prejudice, it loses its legitimacy." The air in the courtroom grew heavy. The man who had walked in accused of a simple traffic violation was now standing as the voice of justice itself, and Mason, once untouchable, found himself shrinking under the weight of that truth. Whispers rippled through the courtroom like a wave spreading across a still pond. At first, they were hushed. Small murmurs passed from one spectator to another, but quickly they grew louder, bolder. For years, many in that small town had walked away from Mason's courtroom with the same bitter feeling that justice hadn't been served equally. They had seen neighbors punished too harshly, family members fined unfairly, and young men spoken to with disrespect. And now, for the very first time, those unspoken truths were laid bare in front of everyone. "He didn't even look at the evidence," one person muttered. "He already decided before the case started," another whispered back. The people had always suspected bias, but today they witnessed it. They had seen the mask slip, and there was no covering it up again. Judge Mason's face turned crimson. His hands trembled slightly as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. He was no longer in control of the room. The stares, the whispers, the uncomfortable silence. Between sentences, it all pressed down on him like a weight he could not shake. In a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, Mason leaned forward and forced a weak smile that fooled no one. His voice cracked as he said, "Of course, Prosecutor Wright, let's review your evidence properly." But it was too late. Everyone had already seen how quick he was to dismiss Jordan before knowing who he really was. Everyone had already heard the words, "people like you." Mason's sudden attempt to appear fair came across not as justice, but as panic. Jordan didn't respond with anger. He didn't need to. The courtroom itself had already judged. Mason, the spectators. Expressions told the story: disbelief, disgust, and for some, a sense of long-awaited vindication. The gavel that Mason once wielded like a weapon now seemed powerless. His authority, once absolute, was crumbling right there in the open. And though he tried to backtrack, every eye in that room knew the truth. Justice had been compromised, and Mason had been caught red-handed. There was no undoing what had been revealed. The damage was done. With steady hands, Jordan reached into his folder and retrieved the evidence he had carried with him from the very beginning. He connected the dash cam footage to the court's display system, and within seconds, the screen flickered to life. The video played in front of everyone. It showed Jordan driving cautiously, keeping to his lane, when suddenly another car swerved recklessly in front of him, cutting him off. The footage was crystal clear. Jordan had yielded properly, and the dangerous maneuver belonged to the other driver. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of the footage playing. Every second that ticked by was another nail in Mason's coffin. There was no denying what the evidence showed. Jordan was innocent. When the clip ended, Jordan calmly produced still frames from the video, highlighting the exact moment the other vehicle veered into his path. He laid them out neatly on the table, his professionalism undeniable. "As you can see, Your Honor," he said firmly, "the citation was issued in error." The silence broke with a few audible gasps. Some spectators even nodded, satisfied that the truth was now in plain sight. Judge Mason, red-faced and sweating, had no choice left. Clearing his throat, he muttered, "Case dismissed." His words were clipped, bitter, and reluctant. The gavel struck once, but the sound no longer carried the power it once did. For Jordan, the dismissal was vindication, but for Mason, it was a devastating blow. The entire courtroom had just witnessed him attempt to fine and silence a man without reviewing clear evidence. Worse yet, that man turned out to be a federal prosecutor. Within weeks, the fallout began. Word spread quickly through the town, then across the state. People who had long felt wronged by Mason now had courage to speak. Complaints poured into the state's judicial review board, formal reports detailing years of questionable rulings, harsher sentences for minorities, and an unmistakable pattern of prejudice. This time, the whispers were not ignored. This time, there was proof, and at the center of it all was the dash cam footage in the quiet. Strength of one man who refused to be silenced. The story didn't stay confined to that small-town courtroom. By the next morning, whispers had turned into headlines, and headlines into breaking news. Local outlets ran the story with bold titles. "Racist Judge Humiliated," after targeting federal prosecutor. Soon, regional stations picked it up, and within days, the incident spread across national media platforms. Clips of Jordan calmly presenting his badge. His evidence and his unwavering composure went viral. People shared the footage online with captions like, "This is how you fight injustice, with facts, not fury." The courtroom exchange became more than just a local scandal. It became a symbol of what happens when arrogance collides with truth. For Jordan, the victory was never about embarrassing Judge Mason. It wasn't about revenge, ego, or headlines. When asked later by reporters how he felt about the ordeal, he said simply, "It was never personal. It was about fairness. If this could happen to me, a federal prosecutor, imagine how many ordinary citizens have faced the same treatment without the resources or platform to fight back." His words resonated deeply. Communities that had long felt overlooked finally felt seen. Mason's downfall wasn't just about one case. It was about years of injustice finally catching up with him. Meanwhile, Mason's career unraveled quickly. The Judicial Review Board announced an investigation into his history of rulings. Old cases resurfaced, each one painting a clearer picture of bias and abuse of power. Where once he had been untouchable, Mason now found himself the subject of scrutiny, stripped of the very authority he had abused for decades. And the most painful part for him? His undoing wasn't caused by anger or chaos. It wasn't caused by someone shouting or protesting. It came from a man who refused to be rattled, who let the truth speak louder than any prejudice ever could. In the end, the message was clear. Arrogance may sit on the bench, but justice has a way of finding its voice. For Judge Mason, it was the beginning of the end of his career. For Jordan, it was proof that no matter how heavy the bias, truth always rises. This story reminds us that truth always wins, no matter how much bias tries to bury it. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more powerful stories like this one, make sure to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss when we upload a new story that inspires and empowers.